Welcome again to our scripture sessions. This coming weekend is the 13th Sunday of the church year, and the readings the first reading comes from the second book of Kings and contains a story about the prophet Elisha, who was the successor, as you remember, to the great prophet Elijah. Perhaps we'll have a little time to come back to that story and that chapter, which will give us an opportunity to look a little bit at the second book of Kings. But the story is meant to match an idea that is expressed in the gospel today, which comes from the 10th chapter of Matthew's gospel. The second reading from Romans 6 continues, and we have already looked a little bit at Roman letter. We'll come back to that as we go along with these talks. The 10th chapter of Matthew's Gospel is sometimes known as the missionary chapter. In it, Matthew contains some material that's also found in a source which is traditionally known nowadays as a Q source. Now, you may have heard that term. Q, which comes from the Greek word and Hebrew word qua'al, which in English would be Quelle, namely a collection of sayings that we believe both the gospel writers Luke and Matthew had access to. These would be sayings that are attributed to Jesus that were collected and didn't have any particular pattern, except that, as you might collect wise sayings of people. So the Q source is a theory that has grown in popularity over the last 50 years or so. The only difficulty with the Q, as many point out, is no one has ever seen Q. So if you have this collection of sayings, can we look at them? We don't know, okay? They also affect another work that is known as the Gospel of Thomas. Perhaps at another time we'll have some mention of that. So what Matthew here does in this chapter is set out the mission of the disciples. It begins, and we're going to backtrack a little bit to the earlier part of this chapter. It begins the chapter with Jesus calling together the disciples and apostles and telling them that they have a mission, that they are to have the power to cast out unclean spirits, and that they are to heal every disease and every infirmity. This is their mission. Now, who are those who are going to be sent on mission? And now Jesus chooses the 12. And in Matthew, he aligns the 12 in 6 pairs. So he begins by naming Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew. Then James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. Then Philip and Bartholomew. Then Thomas, and he matches him with Matthew, who is the tax collector. Next comes James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. And then finally Simon the Canaan and Judas Iscariot, the one who handed him over. So neatly, and this was a popular way of sending out preachers or missionaries in pairs. And so he now pairs these 12 together. The names of the 12 apostles appear in other places with some slight variations of who the figures are. But certainly the 4 consistent ones are always Peter and Andrew, James, and John. All right, now that they have a mission to carry out the message of Jesus. Well, what is it? Well, now comes something that is interesting. Jesus is pictured, and you have to go back and read chapter 10 here, not to go to the Gentiles and not to go to the city of the Samaritans, Now, the Samaritans, of course, are an interesting group of people who, by Jesus' time, had set up their own center for their belief on a place called, in a territory rather called Samaria, and on a hill which was called Mount Gerizim. They had also earlier on set up a temple, and there had been a tension between the temple on Mount Samaria and the temple, of course, in Jerusalem. Important to notice, and this could be a little bit disturbing here, where Jesus says, don't go to anybody else but the Jewish community. And the Samaritans, of course, although were partially Jewish, were still kind of considered as outsiders. Now, why is that disturbing? Is the message of Jesus only for the Jewish community? Well, keep in mind, as we've mentioned before, that the gospel tradition, according to Matthew, was written sometime in the 80s. By this time, the city of Jerusalem had been destroyed, the temple had been destroyed, and for all intent and purposes, the priesthood of Judaism was, well, not destroyed, but there was no real need. Since their job was to offer sacrifice in the temple, if there wasn't any temple to offer sacrifice in, then like some today, they were unemployed at that point. But it's still kind of strange, isn't it, to say that, picture Jesus as saying, don't go to the Gentiles. And it might be important to notice that the gospel tradition, according to Matthew, is most likely written for fellow Jews who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah and the Lord. And so what is going on in Matthew's gospel, and this will be important not only in this little episode, but throughout reading Matthew's story, is to recognize that for all intent of purposes, what is going on in Matthew's gospel is what we might call an in-house discussion or an in-house fight. In other words, this is a battle, or maybe that's not a strong word, between two groups of believers in the way in which Jesus had been raised, in the ways that had been taught from the days of Moses right on down. Namely, exactly how do we carry out the tradition of our foreparents? How do we best live the way of God that had come from Moses? We remember the great stories of Moses, his receiving the law, the Torah. How do we live the Torah in our own time and place? Now, earlier on in this gospel, Matthew's gospel, Jesus had been pictured as saying, I have not come to change any of the law. In fact, I have not come to change even one letter of the law, not even one small letter of the law. And I may have mentioned that the smallest letter of the law in Judaism might be the size of a pepper, a piece of pepper, okay? So it's really tiny. But what I have come to do, Jesus is pictured as saying, to bring it to a new level, to bring it to something that it was not before. Not to abrogate what went before, but to raise it to a new dimension, to a new level. And so, in this gospel, Matthew pictures Jesus as saying, your essential mission, brothers, apostles, is to go to fellow Israelites and to share with them the good news, the message of the kingdom that I have come to proclaim and that you are partners in proclaiming. Now, what is this message? The message is the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. It's interesting in this gospel, Matthew's gospel, that the word God is not used. It is the kingdom of heaven. Because, as you remember, in Judaism, the name of God is never to be said. So again, you can see the Jewishness of Matthew's gospel. by his great respect. Just notice that. Our Father who art in heaven. See, that the understanding of the word that encapsulates who the divine reality is one that is never said. There are some ways in which the Hebrew community overcame this by speaking of God as Adonai. And many point out it equates to the term God. But my point a little bit here is that this gospel is really a discussion going on among fellow Hebrews as to what is the best way to honor God. And of course, for the Christian Jews, the best way is to accept Jesus and his teaching. So that's why Matthew's words here may sound a little harsh at first. Don't go to any of the outsiders or the Gentiles. Because truly, by the time that Matthew's gospel is written, a number of outsiders or Gentiles are believers in Jesus and have accepted the way. But in presenting this story, the tension here is now between as I said, fellow Hebrews. You know how it is, I may have mentioned this before, but in family fights, now you never have family discussions that get to words that maybe are a little stronger, words that maybe I wouldn't use from the pulpit, but when you use those kind of words with fellow family members, they can be pretty raw, but all right, they're members of the family. They get it. They get that you're mad. They get that you want them to change their attitude. But in the end, family is family. And that's important to notice here, that in this gospel, that tension is between fellow Hebrews. They know how it works. They know the things that will irritate. And so Matthew's Jesus will say things that will irritate the Jewish leaders because that works in the ballpark that they are all familiar with. Now I mention this because unfortunately in the course of history, sometimes Matthew's gospel has been used to support anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. You see, what I'm saying is, this isn't a struggle between Christian Gentiles or Christians and Jews, but it's a struggle between Jews and Jews. And sometimes that, of course, has been lost throughout history and has been the cause of very deep hardship between the two great religions, namely Christianity and Judaism. So Jesus now sends out his disciples. Again, this was message that we heard last week when the section of chapter 10 was used, and this coming week, again, a further section. As they are sent out, well, what does the gospel writers suggest? That they are like sheep without a shepherd. A kind of jab at the Jewish leadership that are not believers in Jesus, as they're not very good leaders, okay? You get it. See, you kind of give it to them a little bit, okay? But, you are going out as truly shepherds in my behalf with the sheep who will receive the message. And they are, and here's a familiar kind of pattern in Old Testament, lost sheep. Now, other gospel writers will pick up the lost sheep idea, but you, my fellow advocates, disciples, apostles, are seeking them out and hopefully will bring them back. Now, how do you do this? Well, you proclaim that the kingdom of heaven is near at command and at hand. And remember, you have 4 things that you are asked to do: heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. Now, where do you hear some of this? Well, you hear some of this in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible, and you can kind of check that out. Well, as you go along now, they are instructed, travel lightly. Why? Why this admonition on the part of Jesus to the apostles to do this? Well, because the idea of itinerant preachers, namely preachers that moved around from place to place, was not unknown in Jesus' world. Important philosophers used to do this. They would travel around the Mediterranean world, kind of grouping people together when they were there, teaching them their way of life. But what were some of the things to be cautious about? Well, it's important that they do and say what Jesus said and did. After all, they are his ambassadors. They are not to deny or demand a fee for the gospel. Why? Because some philosophers, when they came around, took up a collection. Sounds like church, doesn't it? But they took up a collection, and Jesus says, no, you're not to do that. You're not to carry around with you a large supply of food and dressing, which again is what many of these traveling preachers did. They brought their own food. They brought their own kind of dress changes. So don't you do that. Carry no food. You are not to look out for the best accommodations, which of course important people when they came to town would say, well, why should I stay in a 3-star when I can stay in the Hilton, you know? I would go to the nicest place. You go wherever they invite you in. You see, so much of, and then of course, what do you do when they don't accept you? And what Jesus encourages his disciples to do is just leave them alone. Don't debate with them. There's a little expression there which was understood by everybody, shake the dust off your feet, okay? Well, that meant that you didn't take anything of them with you, not even the dirt that got your feet dirty. And you see, if you were a fellow Hebrew, you got it. You saw what Jesus is advising to do, and let the rest of it to God's judgment, okay? So, and then it also says, don't stay more than a day or 2, because if you stayed 3 days, then most people would know you were a fraud. So, you see, there's a whole custom that is the basis for Jesus' advice now in chapter 10 to what his disciples should do. But if they welcome you, stay there. Don't move around from place to place. Give the message as long as it is needed and move on. This is your message, and this is your mission. It also says, whoever welcomes a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. Now, it's with that in mind that the first reading today is chosen. It comes, as I said, from the 2nd book of Kings, and it basically is one of the stories connected with the prophet Elisha. Now, Elisha appears at the beginning, and this is an interesting section of Kings, the first, 2nd Kings. By the way, there's a first book and a second book of Kings, and if you wonder why there's a first book and a second book of Kings, you know the reason why? The reason why is that when you wrote, there was only so much space on a given parchment. And so if you had more to say, you went on to a second parchment. It wasn't that it was a second book, but it was that there wasn't a room for the message on the next page. So actually, 1st and 2nd Kings is one great story. Just as a little aside as to why you have 2 books, and that's true about some other books in the Bible. 1st and 2nd books of Samuel fit the same pattern. It just ran out of space, and so they started a second parchment, became a second book. Today we don't usually have that problem. So Elisha is the successor to Elijah. There are interesting stories and I'm going now to the first 8 chapters of the second book of Kings. You might want to read this. There's a little opportunity in the course of the year to look at it. And there are some familiar stories that are used throughout the church year that do come from this book. Elijah is going to leave, and on a couple of occasions he wants Elisha not to follow him, and Elisha keeps saying, wherever you go, I'll go. And that, of course, is an important reminder that Elisha in some ways like the disciples, go wherever Jesus goes. You can, again, make that comparison. So finally, Elijah can't get rid of Elisha. He keeps following him. They go to a couple of places. As the story opens, they go to a place called Gilgal. They go to Bethel. They cross the Jordan. And finally, as you know, Elijah is taken up in a fiery chariot into heaven. Elijah made one statement, well, what would you like, Elisha? And Elisha says, I'd like a double load of whatever you got. Well, that's kind of flattery too, and that's exactly what he gets. As Elijah goes up into the heavens, his garment, his cloak floats down. Elisha puts it on, uses that, cuts up his own. And of course, there's little stories there, as you know, that as they go back and forth across the Jordan, their little garment divides the water and they cross on dry land. Everyone likes to cross the Jordan who's important on dry land. Next time you go, see if you can pull that one off, crossing the Jordan on dry land. Now, Elisha, there's a number of stories that are connected with Elisha. One is that they're looking for water as the place he goes by. They're having trouble. So he tells them, fill up all the buckets you can with water. He puts a little bit of salt in, and everybody has enough water. There are a lot of what we would call miracle stories connected with Elisha. And this is one of them. We don't hear these on Sunday because there's really no opportunity for that. On another occasion, leading up to the episode that fits the gospel passage for today, is a multiplication of oil. Now, this story sometimes appears on one of the Sunday readings, where Elisha is faced with feeding 100 soldiers, and all he has is enough to feed 20. But wondrously, they're all fed, the 100 soldiers, with only this 20 loaves of bread. Well, now you can see later on, the gospel writers love this one. Jesus can feed thousands with only 5 loaves of bread. And so on that occasion, this story from about Elisha is incorporated on that particular Sunday, which does not occur this year. Now we come to the story of the woman of Shunem. Now, she out of the blue, and by the way, ladies, this is a great story because this woman controls the whole story. Even her husband, he goes along with her. I know some of you are familiar with that. Others, maybe that doesn't always happen, okay? Anyway, along comes the prophet Elisha, and she says to him, listen, you travel back and forth here. Why don't you stop here? Have dinner with us. And by the way, I got a room upstairs that you could use when you come by. And her husband just kind of blinks his eye and says, okay, dear, whatever you say. Interestingly, we never know her name, okay? But so her hospitality to a prophet, and of course, now get the connection to the gospel passage that we hear this week. And that seems to be a pattern. Now, the story continues, and that is not presented here, that Elisha who didn't ask for this to happen, says, well, dear, what would you like? I don't know if he used the word dear, but he said, what would you like? And before she can give an answer, she's going to say, you're going to have a son. So whether she was wanting to be an expectant mom, we don't know. But of course, as good stories go, she has a son. Well, a little while later, the son, who is out in the field working with his father, suddenly has all kinds of pains, is brought in. Dad puts the son on his mother's lap, and the boy dies. She puts the boy who has died up on the bed of Elisha, and then sends word to Elisha. Well, Elisha says, well, all right, and he wants to send his servant to, and she says, no, you come. And he comes, he says some prayers. He goes upstairs where the boy who has died is. He says some prayers. That doesn't work immediately. Then he lays on the deceased boy and comes back to life. So you can see in Elisha also the basis for a healing story, which the disciples are sent out to do. So I mentioned the rest of the story is, remember Paul, what's his name, used to always say in his programs, those who are older will remember that. But the little section that is chosen for this week simply is her generosity in offering a prophet a place to stay. Stay wherever they invite you, says the gospel. Don't move around. Don't be looking for a better place. So, as I mentioned before, the first reading is often chosen to kind of highlight some aspect of the gospel, and that's the part that is brought to question today. As you may know, there are other stories about Elisha. The one in chapter 5, which follows from this, is the story of Naaman, the Syrian, who is cured of leprosy. And that is a kind of interesting story, which does appear, I think, sometimes during the year. Elisha doesn't always meet with outsiders. It's interesting that the Syrian, who is an army general who has defeated the Hebrews, when he comes to Elisha to ask for his help, Elisha sends out his servant. Don't go to anyone except your own. There might a little be a tinge of that story in the Matthew account also that we mentioned earlier today. Anyway, he's told, go bathe 7 times in the Jordan. He says, what's wrong with the rivers back at home? His servant says, why don't you just listen to him? What's the problem? Go take a bath in the Jordan 7 times. And he is cured of his leprosy, okay? He doesn't want to take anything. Elisha says, I don't want any money. Unfortunately, his servant kind of says, look, if the boss doesn't want it, I'll take it. And Elisha's a little upset when he does that and says, you inherit what Naaman was disinherited of. And so as he walks into the sunset, you can see the flaky white of leprosy on the servant. Well, the mission, again, that is entrusted to the disciples, the apostles, in chapter 10. We've heard now, this week and last, there is a cost. And of course, as we heard, the cost sometimes, and this would be very painful for them, often brought about division within the family. Within one's own family, some accepted Jesus and some didn't. And the gospel writer pictures Jesus as warning his disciples that this would happen. But notice that it is also a division within Judaism itself. Some will accept Jesus, others will not. And so that tension was very real in the time in which Matthew's gospel was written and being appreciated. Of course, we interpret it in different ways now. But I would conclude by reminding us that this gospel should never be used as a way of pitting Christians against Jews, because the intention of the gospel never was that. And of course, in more recent times, we apologize for the way in which we have unfortunately used Matthew's gospel to our sisters and brothers of the Jewish faith, but a lot of water has gone under the bridge. A lot of hurt has taken place. So maybe today we remember the wonderful gift that each of us are called in our own time and in our own ways to carry out the mission, the message of Jesus. That's the purpose of chapter 10. As Jesus taught and did, so should the disciples, and so should we. Thank you for being with us, and have a good week.